The human's act of kindness. The city of Orvalis stood proud with towering crystalline arches and wide avenues where the noble classes paraded under the pale suns of their world. The empire of the Vaith had endured for centuries, built on strength, obedience, and the harsh belief that the weak should remain in the shadows. Into this society had come a single human, an engineer named Marcus Hale, sent as part of a trade agreement to assist in repairing damaged starship engines. To the Vaith he was tolerated. Nothing more, a foreigner with useful skills who was expected to stay silent and not meddle with their way of life. Marcus accepted this cold treatment with quiet patience, for he had grown used to alien suspicion during his journeys. One evening as he walked home from the starport, Marcus heard a faint cry near the edge of the avenue. He turned and saw a small figure struggling to move, a child no taller than his waist. The child's skin shimmered with the pale silver hues of the Vaith, but one of his legs was twisted, thin and frail, unable to carry weight. The boy dragged himself along the stones, clutching at walls as passers-by ignored him. Some sneered, some whispered insults, but none offered help. Marcus paused, his heart tightening at the sight, for he knew the cruelty of pity withheld. He knelt beside the child and spoke softly, though he knew the boy's language was limited. The child looked up, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of shame and fear, as if expecting another cruel word. Instead, Marcus smiled and offered his hand. The boy hesitated, then grasped it with surprising strength for his small body. Marcus guided him to a nearby step and sat with him, watching as the boy tried to stand but faltered again. The sight tore at Marcus, and in that moment he resolved to do something that no one else dared. That night he returned to his small quarters and searched through scraps of alloy and spare tubing he had collected from repair jobs. He worked quietly under dim light, his hands steady and precise, shaping a tool that was simple yet powerful in its meaning. He carved supports, adjusted lengths, and padded the grip with woven cloth. By dawn, he held in his hands a makeshift crutch strong enough to bear the child's weight. It was not elegant, but it was sturdy and practical, the kind of thing that a human survivalist would craft on a harsh world. The next day, Marcus returned to the same street carrying the crutch. The boy was there again, moving slowly, his movements filled with frustration as he tried to keep up with other children who mocked his limp. Marcus approached and knelt once more, holding out the crutch. The boy stared at it, confusion written across his face. Marcus demonstrated by leaning on it, mimicking how it would hold his weight. Slowly, he guided the boy's arm into place and lifted him. For the first time, the child stood tall without collapsing. His eyes widened in shock, then joy, as he took a trembling step, then another, the crutch steady beneath him. The nearby children stopped laughing and instead gaped in silence. Adults passing by frowned, whispering to one another, uneasy at the sight of a human changing the life of one of their kind. But the boy's laughter rang out bright, echoing through the avenue. He walked, halting but proud across the stones, each step a declaration that he was no longer bound to crawl. He turned and looked at Marcus, his voice trembling as he spoke a single word in his language, a word that meant friend. Marcus felt warmth in his chest, stronger than any reward he had ever earned for his work. Yet he also noticed the cold stares of the onlookers, the way some turned quickly away as if fearing punishment for witnessing. He knew then that this act of kindness, simple to him, would not be seen as harmless in the rigid eyes of the Empire. But he did not regret it, not for a moment. That night word spread through the district. Whispers carried tales of the human who had given a crippled child the strength to walk. Some called it sorcery, others called it defiance, and a few dared to call it hope. In the chambers of nobles, voices murmured that this foreigner had crossed a line, that he had interfered with the natural order decreed by the emperor himself. Yet among the poor there was quiet awe, for they saw in the child's proud steps a spark of something long denied to them. Marcus, unaware of the storm building above him, simply rested that night with the memory of the boy's smile. He believed he had done nothing more than what any decent man should. But in the empire of the Vaith, where compassion was seen as weakness and kindness as rebellion, his small gift had already set forces in motion that he could not yet imagine, and while he slept, the emperor himself was informed of the act that would soon shake the entire throne. Whispers of hope and fear. The following day, the streets of Orvalis buzzed with quiet tension, for the sight of the child walking with the strange device had spread beyond the neighborhood and into the wider city. In the market district, merchants who had once dismissed the human as a curiosity now spoke in hushed tones about the tool he had crafted. Some claimed it was a clever trick of mechanics, while others whispered that it was a dangerous sign of human sorcery. The people of the Empire had long been taught that humans were unpredictable death-worlders whose ways did not belong among the ordered hierarchy of the Vaith. Yet here was proof that a single human's hand could change what their traditions had left untouched for generations. The child himself now walked with a confidence none had seen before. His steps were uneven but sure, and the crutch gave him balance where once there had been only pain. Other children watched him with wide eyes, no longer mocking but filled with a mix of admiration and envy. Parents pulled their young away, whispering that they should not linger near the foreigner's creation, but the image of the lame child striding across the stone stayed in every mind. Marcus noticed the change as he walked to his duties at the starport. He felt the weight of eyes on him more than ever, some filled with curiosity, some with cold disdain. He had not intended to draw attention, but the act could not be hidden. Even among his fellow workers, he sensed the shift. A Vaith mechanic who had once spoken to him in clipped, indifferent phrases now asked quietly how the crutch had been made. Marcus explained in simple terms that it was only leverage and balance, a tool to help where nature had failed. The mechanic nodded slowly but said no more, clearly torn between respect and fear of what this might mean. By nightfall, the story had traveled into the halls of authority. In the great palace carved from crystal and obsidian, the Emperor's advisors debated fiercely. Some warned that if humans were allowed to spread such inventions, the people would begin to question why their rulers had never done the same. Compassion was not a virtue in the Empire, obedience was, and the human had planted a seed that could grow into defiance. Others dismissed it as a trivial gesture, a bauble unworthy of the Emperor's concern, but the louder voices declared it a threat. When the tale reached the Emperor himself, he listened in silence. His throne room was vast, its vaulted ceilings echoing with the sound of guards' armor. The Emperor's eyes glowed with cold intensity as he considered the report. In his empire, strength was law and weakness was to be hidden, yet a human had dared to lift the weak into the light. To him, this was not kindness, it was rebellion against the natural order. With a single motion of his hand, he silenced the bickering voices of his court. His decree was short and sharp. The human was to be watched, and if his influence spread, he was to be arrested for disrupting imperial order. Unaware of the storm gathering, Marcus continued his work. He repaired engines, adjusted circuitry, and carried on as if nothing had changed, though he noticed the child often lingered near the starport, practicing his steps. The boy's laughter whenever he managed a longer stride was a sound Marcus cherished, even if it drew stares from others. He spoke gently with the boy when he could, teaching him balance and encouraging his determination. He saw no crime in what he had done, no challenge to authority, only the simple truth that no one should be left behind if help could be given. But already the people around them felt the weight of conflict. Neighbors argued in whispers late into the night, some saying the human should be praised for his compassion, others insisting that such defiance would bring punishment upon the whole district. The child's family faced both admiration and scorn, and his parents began to fear that their son's newfound strength might place them all in danger. In the shadows of Orvalis, the human's act of kindness had ignited something the Empire could not easily control. To some it was a flicker of hope, proof that even the smallest life could be lifted by the hands of another. To others it was the spark of fear, a dangerous reminder that humanity's strength did not lie only in weapons and technology, but in the stubborn will to care even when forbidden. And far above, in the palace of glass and stone, the Emperor had already decided that this small flame could not be allowed to burn unchecked. The imperial summons. The news reached Marcus slowly, but its weight was heavy. He had been summoned to the palace, an order carried by armored guards who stood at his doorway with no trace of warmth in their faces. Their voices were clipped as they told him the Emperor demanded his presence. Marcus understood enough of their culture to know this was not an honor, but a warning. The palace was a place where decrees were made and punishments were carried out, and few commoners ever entered its gates willingly. He could not refuse. For refusal meant immediate chains, so he nodded calmly and gathered himself for the journey. The path to the palace cut through the heart of Orvalis, Streets that had once been alive with chatter fell silent as the human passed, flanked by soldiers. The people stepped aside, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the guards. Some whispered that the foreigner had gone too far, that his kindness had become a crime. Others looked on with hidden admiration, wondering if he might somehow defy the emperor himself. The child he had helped was nowhere in sight, though Marcus felt certain the boy knew of what was happening. He hoped the child would remain safe, far from the storm that was gathering. The palace itself rose like a mountain of glass and stone, its spires gleaming in the twin suns. Within its gates the air was cooler, heavy with the silence of authority. Marcus was led through towering halls where mosaics depicted the conquests of the Vaith, each image a reminder of their belief in strength and dominion. He was brought before a chamber where nobles sat in a half-circle, their robes shimmering with wealth. At the center, on a throne carved from black crystal, sat the emperor. His presence was overwhelming, a figure whose gaze seemed to pierce through flesh and bone. The court was already filled with argument. Advisors spoke in sharp voices, their words echoing off the polished walls. One elder declared that the human had broken no law, that he had simply used his skill to aid a child, but his words were quickly drowned by others who warned of rebellion. They argued that if humans were allowed to show compassion, then the weak might begin to believe they had value, and such belief could fracture the empire's rigid order. The emperor raised his hand and the chamber fell into silence. Marcus was ordered to step forward. He did so without bowing, for though he respected the customs of others, he would not feign submission to tyranny. The emperor studied him in silence, his eyes narrowed. Then he asked a single question, his voice carrying through the hall like thunder. Why had the human interfered in the life of one of his subjects? Marcus answered simply, saying that he had seen a child in pain and had acted as any decent being would. He explained the crutch, how it was nothing more than wood and alloy shaped to give balance. He meant no insult to their laws, only mercy. The court erupted once more, some voices mocking him, others condemning his arrogance. One noble spat that humans were dangerous precisely because they believed mercy had value, for mercy bred weakness. Another warned that the people were already whispering, that the sight of the child walking proudly had stirred questions that should never be asked. The emperor listened without expression, his fingers drumming on the arm of his throne. At last he spoke, his voice cold and precise. He declared that while the human's invention was small, its meaning was great. In the empire of the Vaith, only the emperor decided what gifts could be given, and no outsider had the right to alter the life of his subjects without permission. To do so was to challenge his authority, and a challenge to the throne was rebellion. He did not order Marcus's execution, not yet, but he decreed that the human was to be closely watched. Should he attempt another such act, the punishment would be swift and severe. Guards were ordered to shadow his every step. Marcus bowed his head slightly, not in obedience but in acknowledgement that he understood the words. He felt the stares of the court burning into him, some filled with hatred, a few with quiet respect. He knew the emperor's warning was not the end but the beginning, for kindness once given could not be erased, and the child who now walked with his crutch would not vanish into silence. The empire had been shaken by a single act of humanity, and the emperor, for all his power, had revealed his fear. Marcus was escorted from the chamber, his fate uncertain, yet in his heart he carried no regret. He had done what was right, and he would not stop being human even in the shadow of a throne. Betrayal and capture. The days after Marcus's summons to the palace moved with an uneasy quiet. The city of Orvalis still whispered about the human and the child he had helped. Guards watched him wherever he went, their eyes cold, their presence heavy. Marcus carried on with his work repairing engines at the starport, trying to remain unnoticed. Yet he felt the air around him change. Friends who had once greeted him with cautious nods now avoided his gaze, and neighbors shut their doors quickly when he passed. The empire's suspicion had seeped into every stone of the city. The boy he had helped still came to see him, walking proudly on the crutch. Each time Marcus saw him take a step, his heart felt lighter, but he also noticed the fear growing in the child's parents. They knew the emperor's decree, and they feared their son's progress might bring ruin upon them all. Marcus tried to reassure them that no harm would come, but he could see in their eyes that they no longer believed safety was possible. Not everyone viewed the boy's strength with admiration. Among the neighbors was a merchant named Valor, a man consumed by envy. For years he had sought the Emperor's favor, yet he remained ignored. Now, with nothing more than scraps and human skill, Marcus had earned whispers of respect and stories that spread across the district. Valer's jealousy turned to bitterness, and bitterness to treachery. He told himself he was protecting the Empire, but in truth he longed to see the foreigner humbled. One night he slipped into the barracks of the city guard and whispered poison into their ears. He spoke of the human gathering followers, of secret meetings with the child's family, of plans to undermine the Emperor's order. The guards, already uneasy under their Emperor's decree, listened with grim faces. By dawn, orders were signed. The human was to be taken. Marcus awoke to the sound of heavy boots on stone. The door to his quarters was torn open, soldiers flooding inside with weapons drawn. He raised his hands calmly, though his heart raced. They shouted accusations, claiming he sought to turn the people against the throne. Marcus tried to protest, saying he had done nothing but offer a child the chance to walk, but his words fell on deaf ears. The guards seized him, binding his wrists in chains of cold alloy. The commotion drew a crowd outside. Neighbors peered from windows. Children clung to their mothers, and whispers spread through the street. And then came the boy. He pushed through the crowd, his crutch steady beneath him, his small frame trembling with fury. He cried out to the soldiers, demanding they release the human, calling Marcus his friend, his savior. The boy tried to throw himself between Marcus and the guards, but a soldier shoved him aside harshly. He stumbled, fell hard onto the stones, and the crowd gasped as his cry echoed. Marcus's heart burned as he watched the child struggle back to his feet, tears streaming down his silver cheeks. The boy tried again to reach him, but the soldiers held him back. Around them, the people of the district began to murmur. They had been taught to stay silent, to obey. Yet in that moment, many felt a stirring of anger. The Emperor's fear was plain to see. Why else would a ruler command the arrest of a man whose only crime was kindness? The guards dragged Marcus through the streets, their grip iron strong. He kept his head high, refusing to show fear. The boy limped behind as far as he could, calling out until his voice broke. Some among the crowd wanted to step forward to stop the injustice, but centuries of obedience kept them rooted in place. Only their eyes betrayed the truth, wide with shock at what they had seen. By the time Marcus reached the palace gates, the tale had already begun to spread once more. Whispers ran faster than soldiers, carried on every tongue. The Emperor sought to chain the human not for rebellion but for compassion. The weak had been shown strength in a way the throne could not allow. Inside the palace, Marcus was thrown into a cold cell carved into the foundations of black stone. The chains bit into his wrists, but his spirit remained unbroken. He thought of the child, of the defiance in his young eyes, and he knew this story was no longer only his. A crutch had become a symbol, and the Empire itself trembled at the sight of it. Even in chains, Marcus felt a grim certainty. His kindness had lit a fire that no prison walls could smother. Trial before the throne. The morning of the trial dawned heavy with silence across Orvalis. Word had spread that the human would be judged before the Emperor himself, and though the citizens pretended to go about their lives, their thoughts remained fixed on what was to come. Crowds gathered along the palace avenues, kept at bay by armored guards, each person straining to glimpse the prisoner who had dared to defy tradition with nothing more than a wooden crutch. Marcus was dragged from his cell, wrists bound, his clothes torn and stained from the rough handling of the guards. Yet he walked with a steady stride, his gaze forward, his expression calm. He knew fear, but he also knew he would not show it. The great hall of the palace was filled with nobles, generals, and priests, all dressed in shimmering robes of rank. The throne loomed at the far end, carved from obsidian and framed with banners that bore the symbol of the Vaith. The Emperor sat tall upon it, his silver skin glinting under the light, his eyes sharp as blades. The hall buzzed with voices until the guards pushed Marcus forward, and then silence fell like a weight. The Emperor spoke first, his voice smooth and commanding, carrying easily across the chamber. He declared that the human stood accused of interfering in the order of the Empire, of granting gifts that had not been sanctioned by the throne, of inspiring weakness where only strength should rule. Marcus listened quietly, then raised his head and answered. He said he had done nothing more than help a child walk, that compassion was not rebellion, and that if kindness was a crime, then it was a crime he would commit again. His words echoed in the hall, bold and unshaken. A ripple of murmurs spread through the court. Some nobles scoffed, calling his words arrogance, but others shifted uneasily in their seats. They could not deny what they had heard in the city streets, that the people spoke of the human not with scorn but with admiration. And then, just as the emperor prepared to pronounce judgment, a cry rang out from the chamber doors. The child limped forward, supported by his crutch, his small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the hall. Guards tried to stop him, but he forced his way through, his voice trembling but clear as he shouted for the human's freedom. Gasps echoed across the court. The boy bowed before the emperor, though his legs shook, and he begged for mercy. He told the court that Marcus was not a rebel but a friend, that he had given him not a weapon but a chance to stand tall. His words were raw and innocent, and for a moment they pierced the armor of ceremony that cloaked the hall. Some nobles looked away, ashamed, while others whispered to one another, unsettled by the sight of weakness standing so boldly in front of power. The emperor rose from his throne, his voice sharp with anger. He mocked the child's words, saying that humans poisoned minds with their dangerous compassion. He declared that the empire had no need for pity, that strength was the only measure of worth. Yet even as he spoke, he saw the faces of his court, the doubt in their eyes, the unease spreading like cracks through glass. The child's courage had planted seeds that could not be ignored. Marcus stood quietly as the emperor thundered, but inside he felt a surge of pride. The boy had found his voice, and with it he had revealed the truth the empire feared. This was not about a crutch or a single act of kindness. It was about power, about whether the throne could withstand the simple truth that even the weakest life deserved dignity. The trial dragged on with voices rising in argument. Some called for Marcus's execution to restore fear and obedience. Others urged caution, warning that to kill the human would turn whispers into open unrest. The emperor listened, his fury visible, his pride wounded by the defiance of both a foreigner and a crippled child. Yet no final judgment was given that day. Instead, the emperor ordered Marcus held until the court could reconvene, leaving the question hanging like a blade over the heads of all who had witnessed the trial. As Marcus was led back to his cell, he glanced once at the boy who still stood firm despite trembling legs. Their eyes met, and in that brief look Marcus knew the boy understood. They had already won something greater than freedom. They had shown the empire a truth it could not erase, and though chains bound him, the idea of compassion walked freely through the palace halls. The child speaks. The day after the trial, the palace prepared once again for judgment. The emperor had delayed his decree, but the delay only allowed the whispers to spread further. Across Orvalis and beyond, stories grew of the human who gave a crippled boy the strength to walk, and of the emperor who feared that gift so deeply he had placed the man in chains. By the time Marcus was brought forth again, the hall was crowded not only with nobles but with emissaries, scholars, and even commoners of high favor who had demanded to witness. The atmosphere was charged, and beneath the glittering robes and guarded faces lay a tension that threatened to burst. Marcus was led into the chamber, his wrists still bound but his stride steady. He felt the eyes of the court upon him, searching for weakness, but he carried himself with quiet dignity. The emperor sat as before upon his black crystal throne, his expression carved in stone. Though behind the mask of calm, his fury simmered. He wanted obedience, he wanted fear, yet the very act of postponing judgment had already made him appear uncertain. That uncertainty festered in the minds of those who watched. Before the proceedings began, a small voice echoed once more in the hall. The child had returned. He limped forward on his crutch, his thin frame dwarfed by the vast chamber. Yet his presence was undeniable. Gasps rose from the assembly, for the guards had tried to keep him from entering, but he had forced his way through, insisting he had words that must be heard. The emperor scowled, but the boy pressed on, his voice quivering yet strong. He said that the crutch was not a weapon, nor was it a tool of rebellion. It was simply a gift, a chance for him to live without crawling on the ground. He declared that the human had given him dignity when even his own people had turned away. His words rang raw and simple, yet in that simplicity lay a force stronger than any decree. The court murmured, their voices rising as the child spoke of kindness and courage. He turned to the emperor, and though his body trembled, his eyes burned with conviction. He asked why compassion was forbidden. He asked why strength meant turning away from the weak. He asked why his ability to stand tall was seen as a threat when it harmed no one. Silence fell as his questions lingered in the air, each one a challenge the emperor could not easily answer. The emperor's voice thundered at last, calling the child insolent, declaring that humans twisted minds with their softness. He said weakness was a burden that dragged empires into ruin, and that the boy's words were proof of corruption. Yet even as he spoke, the assembly stirred. Some nobles lowered their eyes, unable to deny the child's truth. Others dared to murmur openly, emboldened by his defiance. The emperor, for all his power, was not used to seeing doubt ripple across his court. Marcus watched silently, pride swelling in his chest. He knew the boy's courage came at great risk, yet he also knew this moment would live long beyond the walls of the palace. The child was no longer a symbol of pity but of resistance, a living reminder that compassion could stand against tyranny. The boy continued, his voice steadier now. He said that if kindness was rebellion, then perhaps rebellion was needed. He declared that an empire that feared a simple crutch was an empire already weakened. His words struck like arrows, sharp and undeniable. The crowd gasped, some rising to their feet in shock, others nodding in quiet agreement. The emperor's fury burned brighter, but he did not strike. To harm the child in front of so many would shatter the illusion of justice he clung to. The chamber became a battlefield of voices. Nobles argued, priests shouted of heresy, scholars muttered of change, and the people pressed closer, their whispers growing into chants. Marcus stood tall, the boy beside him, and in that moment the trial was no longer about one human or one child. It had become a question of the empire itself. The emperor raised his hand to silence them all, but even in silence the doubt remained. He could feel his grip slipping, the power he had held unquestioned now trembling beneath the weight of a crippled boy's courage. He declared the trial would continue. That judgment would come with finality, but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. He dismissed the court with fury in his eyes, but as the crowd dispersed, it was clear that something had changed forever. Marcus was taken back to his cell, yet he felt no despair. The child's words had struck deeper than any blade, and the empire had felt the wound. No matter what sentence the emperor delivered, the truth had already spread. A crutch, a human, and a boy's defiance had shaken a throne built on fear. The story was no longer his alone. It belonged to all who had heard it, and it would not be silenced. The turning point. The final day of judgment arrived with the weight of destiny pressing down upon the palace. From dawn, the avenues of Orvalis were filled with citizens, merchants, and even soldiers off duty, who wished to hear what fate awaited the human. Whispers ran like fire that the emperor would make his decision before nightfall, and though no one dared say it openly, many hoped that the throne would show mercy. For others, fear gnawed at their hearts, for mercy was not a word often spoken in the empire. Marcus was brought once more into the great hall. His wrists were chained, but his stride was proud, his head lifted high. The boy was present too, standing among the crowd with his crutch, his family by his side. The nobles filled the chamber, their voices already tense with argument. Some demanded Marcus's execution to restore the throne's absolute authority, while others urged restraint, warning that the people were restless and that a single death could ignite unrest across the provinces. The emperor sat unmoving, his eyes cold and heavy, his silence more terrifying than any outburst. The trial began with accusations repeated, charges of rebellion and interference. Marcus did not interrupt, though his heart burned at the twisting of truth. When asked for his final defense, he spoke simply. He said that he had not sought to change an empire, only to ease the suffering of a child. He reminded them that one act of kindness was now being weighed as if it were treason, and if such kindness was forbidden, then the empire feared more than weakness. It feared humanity itself. His words carried across the hall, stirring murmurs among the assembly. Before the emperor could speak, the boy stepped forward again. He leaned on his crutch, but his voice rang clear, stronger than it had ever been. He said he would not allow Marcus to face this alone. He told the court that if the human was guilty, then he too was guilty, for he had accepted the crutch with gratitude and had walked with pride. He said he would kneel before the throne until the human was freed, even if it meant his life. Gasps filled the chamber, for never had a child spoken so boldly in the emperor's presence. The emperor rose, his fury like a storm. He declared that mercy was weakness and that rebellion must be crushed. He raised his hand to give the order for Marcus's execution, But before the words left his lips, a noble voice rang out in defiance. One of the court elders stepped forward, his robes gleaming, and he said the emperor's command would shatter the empire's unity. Another noble added his voice, then another, until a chorus rose declaring that the people would not accept such cruelty. The hall trembled with shouts and defiance, something unseen for generations. The emperor's hand froze in the air. His eyes scanned the chamber, and he saw not obedience but resistance. His rule, once unquestioned, now balanced on the edge of collapse. He looked at the boy kneeling before him, refusing to move, and at the human standing in chains yet unbowed. For a long moment silence stretched across the hall, and then with a voice that quivered with barely contained rage, the emperor declared the human would be released. The guards hesitated, stunned, but at the emperor's command they unbound Marcus. The chains clattered to the floor, their sound echoing through the vast chamber like thunder. The boy rose, tears streaming down his face, and rushed to Marcus's side. The people gasped, some even daring to cheer, though quickly silenced by fear. The emperor glared down, his pride wounded, his voice sharp as he warned the human never to act above the throne again. Marcus bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement. He knew the emperor's words were not victory but fear disguised as command. The empire had been shaken and no decree could undo it. He placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, steadying him, and together they walked out of the great hall. That night the story spread through every street and every home. They said a human with nothing but scraps and kindness had brought the emperor to doubt himself. They said a child with a broken leg had stood taller than the throne. They said that compassion had shown itself stronger than cruelty. Across the empire the tale grew into legend, a reminder that even the smallest act of humanity could crack the walls of power. Marcus knew his path would never again be safe, but he felt no regret. The boy walked proudly beside him, his crutch steady, his spirit unbroken. And though the emperor still ruled from his throne of black crystal, the people whispered a truth that no chains could silence. A crutch had become a symbol, and the empire would never forget it. The legend of the Crutch years passed after the day Marcus walked free from the emperor's hall, yet the memory of that moment did not fade. It grew with each retelling, whispered in markets, sung quietly in homes, carried even to distant provinces where the reach of the emperor's voice grew. Weak, the boy who had once limped in shame became a young man whose steps carried the strength of defiance. He was no longer seen as frail but as a symbol of what kindness could awaken, and wherever he walked people remembered the crutch that lifted him. Marcus remained in the empire for a time, watched always by suspicious eyes yet never again chained. His presence became a reminder to rulers that power could be challenged not by blades or fleets, but by a simple act of care. He built no armies. He sought no throne yet. His reputation spread further than any general. The weak spoke of him with hope, the strong spoke of him with unease, and the emperor himself, though he never admitted it, felt the shadow of that defiance every time he sat upon his black crystal throne. The empire tried to silence the tale, forbidding its telling. Yet stories are harder to chain than men and children grew up hearing of the day when a human gave dignity to one of their own. Some said Marcus was a fool who risked too much, others said he was a hero who proved that even in the heart of tyranny, humanity's gift could not be smothered. Still others believed he planted the seed of change that one day would break the empire from within. As the boy grew older, he carried the crutch not because he needed it, but because it reminded him of what had been given freely without command. He became a voice for those who had none. And though the emperor raged, he could never erase the truth that had been spoken before his throne. The boy's words remained carved in memory, that strength without compassion is nothing but fear. Marcus eventually left Orvalis, traveling once more among the stars, yet his legend remained rooted in the empire long. After his departure, his name became a quiet promise, whispered by those who longed for freedom and feared the chains of cruelty. He had given them no weapons, no revolutions, only a crutch. Yet in that crutch, they saw the power to stand. And so the story endured, passed from mouth to mouth across generations. A tale of a foreigner who dared to care, a child who dared to speak, and an emperor who dared not strike when faced with the truth. The empire remained, but it was never again the same, for its people had glimpsed another path, and once glimpsed it could never be unseen. The legend of the Crutch became more than history. It became hope. A hope that one day compassion would triumph fully over fear, and that even in the darkest hall of power a single act of humanity could shake the pillars of an empire. The end.